Hello, kind traveler, and welcome to the Mischievous Mare. I am your host and weaver of tales, Vintr Bjorn. Today's video is the start of a series where I read a book called Red Clay Dust, written by my very good friend, Katherine. Without further ado, let us start the first chapter, The Stranger. Make good and sing the songs of old, of legends and deeds and hearts grown cold, of great men sculpted in stone, all gone, not but memory and bone. The legend of the Valerie. The sun glittered off the slate roofing of the chapel, giving the normally gloomy-looking building a brighter appearance. The sky overhead was a brilliant blue. Far in the distance, a storm was brewing on the horizon. Even that would be fortunate, for the crops could use the water. The rusty red clay dust of the barren road floated up into the air. A light breeze coming in off the plains blew it away quickly, swirling through the air like a small tornado. Often the dust became a nuisance and irritated the lungs of the people milling about, sometimes staining the edges of their nostrils the color of bronze. The waves of grass around the town had turned a dull green and brown from the lack of rain. This was a dangerous time, where the smallest stray spark could set lives ablaze. Outside of the butcher's shop, a few of the town's boys were playing ball and kicking up more of that insidious red clay dust. A few buildings away, the blacksmith and miller were leaning outside of the bakery discussing the new gear for the mill. Baker leaned his head out the door, a tray full of hot, fresh pastries in his hands, and lent a word or two to the conversation before returning to his business. Outside the cobbler's, his wife and daughter were hanging their laundry out to dry. They had long ago given up on trying to keep the dreadful red clay dust out of their clean clothes. It stained everything: clothes, skin, hair, and even the wood and stone of their buildings. It was that day, with the storm brewing on the horizon, that the stranger came to town. His white horse was mud-stained, ivory streaked with clay or dried blood. It was impossible to tell. The stallion looked like he had once been proud and full of spirit, but now walked with his head lowered and the heavy steps of exhaustion. His white mane and tail were tangled with burrs and hung lankly against his hide. The stallion's rider looked equally as haggard, although he bore himself with dignity. He kept his back straight in the saddle, even though he looked ready to slip out of it at any moment. The brim of his brown hat was low over his face, hiding him from the prying eyes of the townspeople. A single brown and white feather plumed out from the right side of his hat, hanging as lankly as his horse's mane and tail. A brown riding cloak covered his body, except for his arms and hands holding the reins. He had not been in town for more than a few moments, and yet the foul red clay dust was already beginning to turn his brown cloak and his white sleeves a ruddy shade of red, the same as his horse. The rider seemed a foul omen from the old tales, where beasts and spells tore apart the land, and men struggled to survive. The town was little and out of the way, and there was no inn. No travelers came to this town, but for a few merchant caravans now and then. These folk had lived here all their lives, on the land that had come down from their fathers before them. The town was dwindling year after year, with only a few children, and most of them leaving their parents behind. Some of the braver men and women had left to seek their fortunes in the great city. Some had ridden out into the wilderness and disappeared, driven mad by the barren landscape. There had been a few traders and farmers from neighboring towns and villages, but they had all been good friends or family, and so they had stayed with friends and family. This man was friend of no one. He had no family in this town. He had no cart of goods nor animals to sell. His purpose in this town was a mystery, and that already boded ill for him. The townspeople watched him, their looks neither hostile nor welcoming, as he sat astride his horse while the poor beast labored its way through the streets. Wives and children stood on porches and peered out of windows. Men looked up from their work. The stranger did not look up, did not look around. It was as though he could not see any of the guarded, questioning stares that he was receiving. His horse, as if it knew where to go, steered itself towards the bakery. The stallion stopped, trembling, before the butcher and the miller. Both men looked up at the stranger. There was a long silence as the butcher and the miller simply stared up at the rider. And the rider kept his muteness. He slid from the saddle to land hard on the cracked clay, sending up a plume of red dust that almost hid him from sight. His hat slid from his head, leaving his pale, dirt and blood-smeared face to sight. His long black hair had fallen free of its tie in the back and lay dully across his cheek. His whole body began to shiver and shake. His horse trembled a moment longer, then sank to its knees beside its master and rolled onto its side with a loud cry. Suddenly, the small, quiet town that had only been staring a moment ago was a flurry of activity. The miller stooped quickly and picked the stranger up, gesturing for the butcher to as well. The two of them carried him between them as the baker opened the door and ushered them inside. His wife led them to a bed where they could lay the stranger down. They laid him out and removed his cloak and shirt. His skin felt hot and clammy, and there was a cold sweat all over him. He had heavy bags under his eyes that seemed to pull his eyes back into his skull. His face was creaked with what seemed like a permanent frown. The baker's wife fetched cold water and rags to put cold compresses across his forehead. It was decided that she and her husband would take care of the man for the night. He had fallen on their doorstep, and now, whether blessing or curse, was their burden to bear. The storm broke that night. Thunder rocked the heavens as they opened up and released a torrential downpour on the parched earth. Lightning flashed and illuminated the harsh outlines of the little town against the open plains. The water came in droves, flooding through every crack and gouging miniature canyons in the red clay dust, turning it to mud and silt. The dry little creek filled again with the runoff. Wells, troughs, and all manner of water catchers filled with the precious liquid. And all night that storm raged, the stranger tossed and turned feverishly in his bed. With every cold compress, his fever seemed to grow. The baker's wife tried to give him brews of herbs to bring his fever down, but nothing seemed to work. The baker's wife spent most of the night sure that the stranger would not see the dawn. They had stripped the man of everything they could. The baker had even taken the stranger's breeches and covered him with a light sheet for modesty. He was still drenched in sweat and had soaked the sheets around him. The baker's wife kept her vigil through the stormy night, sewing and humming a quiet lullaby. The stranger cried out feebly a few times, as if he were trapped in an awful nightmare. He shivered harder and harder until his body seemed to convulse. The baker's wife called out for her husband to help as the stranger curled in on himself and shuddered violently. He cried out again and fought with the sheets that were tangled around him. The baker helped to calm the stranger and keep him still while his wife wrapped more cold compresses on the stranger's face, neck, and chest. She opened a window to let in the cold air from the storm. The wind blew out the candles and brought in the cold spray of the rain. With every flash of lightning, the room lit up, and ordinary objects cast frightening skeletal shadows. In the darkness, the stranger's skin looked like alabaster. The tangled sheets spread around him like wings splayed open beneath a wounded falcon. The house shook from a crash of thunder, the loudest yet, and the stranger cried out again. In the light of the next flash, the baker and his wife could forever swear they saw the stranger's eyes. Brilliant, blue, wild, and with narrow pupils. Another flash and his eyes were closed, but the couple was sure of what they had seen. Spooked, they remained in the room, but kept at a distance from the stranger. Outside, hidden from sight by the dark and the people's fear of the storm, a large figure loomed. On all fours it walked, and had it been seen in the flash of the lightning, they would have seen a shaggy, tan fur. Burgundy stripes like wounds marked its sides, and its deep and knowing brown eyes watched the house that the stranger had come to, and howled, drowned out by the clap of thunder before it retreated back into the darkness. By some miracle, as the storm faded and the dawn broke, the stranger was still alive. His fever had broken. And that, kind traveler, is the end of Chapter 1. I hope you did enjoy, and if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. May the rest of your stay be met with good cheer, strong mead, and good company. And as always, safe travels.